Ephraim, if you would like to begin.
Okay. Amazing. Hello. So I'm talking about this teaching and article I did on Mark Fisher, which you can get in Platypus 115. Pick it up and read it. I was just coming up in the lift. I hope you don't mind me saying that. A gentleman said to me in the lift, "Oh, your accent sounds like this guy from this podcast, Trash Future. Comes out of London." And I was like, "Okay, that's cool. What do they talk about?" And he said, "Oh, you know, Mark Fisher." So here I am. And in one of the panels yesterday, we were discussing the phenomenon of young leftists who are just educated on the internet in this weird way. And I think Joe said something like, "What are we going to do? Host bloggers?" So here I am to talk about blogger. I won't go into explaining Fisher fandom, because I don't think it's that interesting. But it's certainly a symptom of our times on the left. 2 years after his suicide with the publication of the anthology K-Punk, he's been being fully canonized, and people discuss him with this slightly odd, familiar melancholy. Those familiar with his work will recognize the title of this panel as being very Mark Fisher, Ghosts of Future Past, with his interest in how we are unable to imagine the future because we're haunted by those ghosts. Fisher was writing in the early 21st century about how history had disappeared, the interminable present of 2006, which had no history because it had no future, and vice versa. It was retromanic cultural malaise at the end of history with no alternative, and it was depressing. So what is history for the 21st century? Well, it seems that it falls to me in this panel in part to address a major symptom of the 21st century, and it's the 20th century, and its meaning for the 21st, namely postmodernism. Fisher was intellectually formed by reading Deleuze, Bataille, Baudrillard, etc. at the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, an academic collective formed at Warwick around Nick Land and Sadie Plant in the early 90s. It's all very postmodern. Following this postmodernism, we might ask, is there even capital H history for the 21st century? Certainly, if we say that history is a concept of the bourgeois revolutions, that the philosophy of history is Hegel's task of freedom, then there is no history for Mark Fisher, looking back from the 21st century, because for him there is no such thing as bourgeois society. This is one of the central claims of my teaching, that following his postmodernist lodestars, Badiou and Deleuze, Fisher elides bourgeois society from the Marxist account of history, not to mention classic liberalism. The idea of freedom dawning on the world with Rousseau, and the tradition of radical thought, bourgeois thought we read in our syllabus, Smith, Kant, Hegel, Sayers, Constant, is all just a ruse, and not in the Hegelian sense, for the destruction of what Fisher calls life worlds. Fisher uses this flat theory of history, flat because of this not having this marker of modernity in bourgeois society, to understand neoliberalism and vice versa. He sees bourgeois revolution as basically just a justification for neoliberalism. In my teaching, I pointed out how this illusion of bourgeois revolution happens quite literally in his book Capitalist Realism. He quotes from the Communist Manifesto and removes the words the bourgeoisie and puts in square brackets capital. Interestingly, Nick Land, in a blog post, makes this move more explicitly. He quotes extensively from the Communist Manifesto and then says, if Marx and Engels had replaced the bourgeoisie with capitalism systematically, then they'd be real accelerationists. So I put in a footnote to the article, at least Land is upfront in telling us that this substitution would alter Marx and Engels' argument. Fisher slips it in without telling us, without any recognition that it might significantly alter the point. The virtue of Land's paltry neo-reactionary right accelerationism is that it need not obfuscate by claiming Marx, as Fisher does, as a left accelerationist, but can be clearer about the consequences of their shared Deleuzian philosophy. Where Marx and Engels see the revolutionary bourgeoisie, Fisher sees capitalism, quote, bending and melting the matter of this and every other world to fit its presuppositions, the greatest theocratic achievement in a history that was never human, end quote. I thought there was something very Heideggerian and postmodern about this formulation. This liquidation of bourgeois society is a consequence of the liquidation of Marxism going all the way back to the 1920s, and that's why Lukács was such a central figure in my thinking going into the teaching. This also traces back to Heidegger, the central thought figure for the postmodernism that Fisher follows. I also thought about this in the panel last night, where one of the panelists said, thank God we've got over Marxism after 1989, because now we can forget that crap historiography of the French Revolution, of orthodox Marxism, and it sort of caught Richard's face fall to the ground. So the meaning of the 20th century from the standpoint of the 21st is the liquidation of history as bourgeois revolution, as the condition for the possibility of any further project of human emancipation. This is what Chris described as the 20th century is the century of counter-revolution at last year's convention, the failure of Marxism liquidating not just Luxembourg but Jefferson, and that Luxembourg's hope for that the revolution is, was, and shall be is based on Jefferson's revolution, the emancipation of labour in the scene with James and Sally Heming in Paris, the task of freedom. So what does history become without the task of freedom? It becomes just the struggle for power. Fisher has his own version of this Foucauldianism, where he says that pre-modern society and modern society only differ as theocratic and secular power. And really he calls this secular power theocratic. One of the weird things about the 21st century is that this postmodernism, which was originally explicitly anti-Marxist, both with Heidegger and his later French followers, has become folded into this weird academic activist theory mush, in which it's all totally consummate with Marxism and the left more broadly. That's why I appreciated Nick Land being so explicit about his right accelerationism. He acknowledges that Marx could only be accelerationist if he dropped all this bourgeois freedom and history stuff. On the other hand, Fisher, as a left accelerationist, sees no problem with saying freedom and history are just myths and then claiming affinity to Marx. In the 21st century, the left refuses history in this other sense. They refuse the claim that ideological differences can't simply be put back together. As Fisher wrote in 2014, we don't have to choose between class politics and anti-authoritarianism any more than we need to choose between Gramsci, Deleuze and Guattari. I recently heard a millennial Labour Party activist and author of a book on the 2010 student protest describe the millennial left as being based on the three Tonys: Tony Gramsci, Tony Negri, and Tony Benn. I think I'll get there, Richard. You ruined my punchline. I think this eclecticism sums up the liquidation of the history of the left in the 20th century for the 21st quite well. Of course, he forgot the fourth Tony, Tony Blair. The panel description says that the 20th century ended with the end of history. But that means that the 20th century ended with the supposed triumph of neoliberalism in 1989. So how does that look now from the crisis of neoliberalism, what Philip Cunliffe's podcast Aufhe Bunga Bunga calls the end of history? The second focus of my article was how Fisher's perspective on the 20th century changed in the crisis of neoliberalism. At the end of history, Fisher thought the New Left made mistakes that we needed to overcome and to be disciplined out of by what he called a Marxist super nanny. But at the end of history, in the crisis of neoliberalism, he thought our problem was not engaging the New Left counterculture enough, shifting from a critique of the New Left to what he called acid communism. The move is the same with the Labour Party, from a critique of social democracy for accepting capitalism to endorsing Corbyn as the way we can ride to post-capitalism. So basically my point is that at the end of history, the left could have considered a critical relationship to the 20th century. But the left botched that task of critique by continuing the anti-bourgeois liquidation of Marxism. And so when the end of history came, they ran back to the 20th century models they had tried to critique, like a prodigal son returning home.